The southern coast of Peru has its own way of keeping secrets. The wind scours the dunes, salt seeps into the fibers of cloth, the desert dehydrates what should decay. And then, when the sand opens, what emerges is not just a relic. A scene emerges. Bundles of the finest fabrics wrapped around mummified bodies, knots tied tight as seals, ritual objects carefully arranged, and beside all this, a presence that captures the eye before the mind. Elongated skulls, some so extreme they seem almost impossible. This is not modern fantasy, not a symbol invented afterward. It is bone, anatomy, matter. And precisely because it is matter, the question becomes more unsettling than any sensationalist theory. What are we really looking at? In the ancient world, intentional cranial deformation is a known fact. In many societies from the Americas to Eurasia, the heads of infants were shaped using bands or boards, taking advantage of the malleability of bones in the early years of life. The result can be spectacular: slanted foreheads, elongated profiles, higher cranial vaults. It is a powerful cultural gesture, because it imprints a sense of belonging on the body, one that cannot be removed. But here we must be precise, almost cruelly so. Deformation alters the external shape and growth directions. It does not rewrite the internal architecture from scratch. It does not create new bones, nor rearrange fundamental structures as if the skull were clay. The skull is a biological compromise. It protects the brain, anchors muscles, allows passage for vessels and nerves, and its sutures close at regulated times. It is an organism, not a container. And so we reach the heart of the Paracas case, for here we are not speaking merely of elongated heads. We are speaking of an archaeological context in which such skulls appear with remarkable frequency, often associated with rich burials and individuals who seem to have held special roles. The Paracas culture, in the first millennium BCE, shows refinement and complexity, textiles of extraordinary quality, elaborate funerary rituals, and even medical practices like cranial trepanation documented at various Andean sites. Within this frame, the necropolis made famous by last century's excavations delivers a clear image, not of a uniform population, but of marked social differences expressed in objects, in fabrics, and perhaps even in the way the body was presented in death. Some researchers and popular writers claim that certain skulls among these show features not explainable by cultural deformation alone. Four are most often cited: a larger internal volume than average, a reduced or apparently absent sagittal suture in some specimens, variations in the position of the foramen magnum at the skull base, and unusual differences in bone thickness. Taken literally, such claims seem to undermine the simplest explanation. Yet this is where science becomes both fascinating and difficult, because science does not deal in instant verdicts. Before turning an anomaly into a conclusion, one must ask how it was measured, with what samples, by what comparisons, and above all, how factors such as age, biological sex, pathologies, natural human variation, and the effects of time on remains might influence the results. For example, to say that a skull has greater volume requires standardized measurements and comparisons with appropriate reference populations. To say that a suture is missing requires distinguishing between one truly absent, one that fused early, one obliterated by age, or one altered by postmortem processes. The foramen magnum, too, is no trivial detail. It is linked to posture and cranial base development, and even small variations can have many causes, from normal individual diversity to deformations that indirectly affect growth patterns. And bone thickness can vary with nutrition, activity, stress, genetics, disease, and preservation conditions. In other words, what seems impossible at first glance may become merely complex when we enter the realm of biology. And yet one fact remains both narratively powerful and scientifically intriguing: social distribution. In many Andean contexts, cranial deformation was a marker of identity. Sometimes it involved entire communities, Sometimes it was selective, tied to specific groups. If in a necropolis the most extreme or particular forms concentrate in the most prestigious burials, the most cautious interpretation is not to leap to the non-human, but to ask what that skull meant to that society. Was it a dynastic mark? A sign of priestly belonging? A way to distinguish one lineage from another? Or, more subtly, was it the outcome of a combination, a cultural practice adopted and refined over time, applied differently depending on status and resources, producing non-uniform results? There is an image that helps keep all these pieces together without forcing them. Imagine a community where a certain physical trait, real or constructed, becomes associated with the sacred and with power. At first, it is reserved for a few, perhaps dominant families, perhaps a ritual order. Over generations, that trait becomes desirable, imitable, almost necessary for access to certain roles. The practice spreads. Techniques become standardized or multiply. And so, alongside skulls showing clearly intentional deformation, we may find more ambiguous forms, borderline cases, variations that spark debate. In this gray zone, where the body becomes both politics and cosmology, the mystery of Paracas changes tone. It is no longer a question of impossible beings, but of how a society could sculpt hierarchy even into bone, and how our modern gaze is tempted to turn every exception into an absolute enigma. Precisely here, when morphology is not enough and form cannot close the story, another promise of truth appears, more intimate, more perilous. That of deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA, and what it can, or cannot, say after nearly 3,000 years of silence. When the word DNA is uttered, many imagine a final verdict, a numerical sequence that closes the case, a signature separating the ordinary from the incredible. But archaeogenetics does not work like a courtroom, it works like a besieged laboratory. Ancient genetic material is fragile, fragmented, often contaminated by everything that came afterward: hands, air, fungi, bacteria, preservatives. The more a relic has been handled, moved, exposed, the more its molecular story becomes a struggle between what it was and what has since settled upon it. The desert preserves much, but not everything equally. DNA, especially nuclear DNA, tends to break apart, and what remains can be so short that it resembles a message reduced to a few syllables. In such cases, scientific honesty means saying, "We have clues, not certainties." That is why, when speaking of genetic analyses attributed to Paracas individuals, three levels must be distinguished. The first, the most solid. There is no verifiable evidence indicating a species other than Homo sapiens. Human sequences remain human, and this point is crucial, because it silences the easiest fantasy without silencing the real mystery. The second level, more intriguing. Some results published over the years indicate mitochondrial profiles or rare variants difficult to place within the best-studied modern Andean populations. This does not mean non-human. It means that comparisons with contemporary databases may yield incomplete matches, especially if ancient populations left few direct descendants, or if migrations and mixtures over time reshuffled the genetic cards. The third level, most delicate, without transparently published protocols, clear sample custody chains, independent replications, and perfectly documented archaeological context for each individual analyzed. Any claim, however sincere, remains fragile. So what remains, if we remove the alien and leave science with its uncertainties? What remains is a hypothesis paradoxically stronger for being plausible. An elite can be biologically distinct without being other. It can be so through endogamy, repeated marriages within the same group, amplifying certain traits over time. Or through a founder effect, when a community descends from few individuals and certain variants become frequent by chance. It can happen through poorly documented ancient migrations, through encounters between coastal and highland peoples, through exchange networks that carried not only shells and pigments but also people. It can happen even because social selection and cultural practice reinforce each other. If a certain cranial profile is prestigious, those in power might apply deformation more systematically, earlier, more intensely, with better tools, producing more extreme and consistent results, making what is natural appear to be a perfected technology of the body. There is also a detail often overlooked, yet it changes perspective. Societies inherit not only genes, they inherit ideas about what constitutes a worthy body. When a physical trait becomes a symbol of the sacred, it ceases to belong to the individual and becomes a public sign. And a public sign, by definition, is copied, contested, imposed, defended. If at certain historical stages the most extreme skulls appear mainly in elite burials and later, more standard deformations spread among the population, that can reveal a social dynamic. An elite model diffusing downward, a ritual fashion becoming norm, a language of power passing from ruling families to communities aspiring to that power. There is no need to imagine an impossible lineage to see a very human drama, the race to resemble those who command. And yet, even after saying all this, something subtle remains, something that makes Paracas so magnetic. The feeling that among the fabrics and bones lies a larger story, one about origin and legitimacy. For elites, almost everywhere, tell themselves they are different by birth, by blood, by cosmic mandate. It is a mechanism as old as politics. In Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and many other traditions, the same idea recurs. Wise figures arriving from elsewhere, teaching, founding, separating sacred from profane. Seen with modern eyes, this may look like the record of impossible encounters. Seen anthropologically, it is a language, a way to say that power is not just force, but the order of the world. If an ancient coastal Peruvian community buried its most important figures with distinctive bodily signs, it may have done the same with myths, genealogies, origin stories, not as proof of celestial visitors, but as a cultural technology that made hierarchy inevitable. The point, then, is not to choose between all normal and all inexplicable. The point is to accept that authentic mysteries exist that need not be extreme. A skull may result from bands and boards and still bear the mark of political identity. A genetic profile may be fully human and yet tell of forgotten migrations, isolation, or contact. An anatomical anomaly may arise from natural variability or growth conditions, yet still become a defended and meaningful symbol. Paracas forces us to balance on this line, between the temptation to dismiss and the temptation to believe without measure. Between them lies something rarer, and more unsettling in its simplicity. The possibility that beneath the red dunes lies not a secret exploding into revelation, but a human story so complex it resists every shortcut. And perhaps that is what truly frightens us, that the past is not a closed tale. It is a body still speaking, even when its language is made of bone. If you have come this far, it means you love curiosity as much as we do. If you enjoyed this journey, leave a like, write a comment, and subscribe to the channel. It's the best way to support what we do. Your presence truly makes a difference. Until the next exploration.